folks, welcome back. Alex Lokes here, and today we are going to be doing the dance. Not actual dancing, you do not want to see that, but rather the dance. That is the process in which one shoots large format. So I'm going to walk you through the steps that I take, right from the beginning, from getting the film loaded to going out, composing the image, shooting the image, and most importantly, metering the image. So let's head over to the kitchen table and we can get that film loaded into the holder. So as you can see, like any sort of loading process, whether it's onto reels for development or into holders for 4x5, it needs to be done in the dark. So I have this change bag. It's a little tight to work with 4x5, especially this number of sheets, but it does a good enough job. I just have to make sure I have this all laid out. Now I've figured out this layout and I've just stuck to it. So I have my box of film here, my empty holders here, and the dark slides here, all with the shiny side facing up. So I just have to slide them in because I'll be using the black side of things for an exposed sheet. So that's super important. And the order doesn't really matter in here because I'm all shooting the same one. So I'm going to close this up. So the trick with loading your film holders is that you need to make sure that the actual emulsion side is facing up. And thankfully, there's very little in the way of guessing in regards to this, because each sheet has what's called a notch code. And sometimes it's a very simple code, just a single notch. Other times it's fairly proprietary. But with that notch, as long as you've figured out which way you have your film holders, in my case, I have the opening facing towards me. That means my notch needs to be facing me and on my left side. And then you just have to slide it in, make sure it gets between the rails. And then once that's done, you double check it, and you slide in. And that also acts as a check too. If you feel resistance, that means that your film sheet has actually gone into the rails that your dark slide goes onto, rather than the actual rails. There are still tons of things that can go wrong, but this is kind of boring and routine, so we're just going to speed up the footage, and I'll talk to you on the last holder. Okay, last sheet. So even though I've done this hundreds and hundreds of times and it seems like I'm running on automatic, I'm still doing tiny checks every time I load it, just to make sure nothing can go wrong. Alright, so now that the film's loaded, what am I actually going to be shooting with today? Well, my one and only large format camera is my Crown Graphic. So I'm going to be shooting 8 sheets of Ilford HP5, and I'm going to be rating it at box speed. That is ASA 400, and I'm going to be developing it using the Stearman Press SP445 developing tank. And for the developer, I'm going to be using FA 1027, which is a fine art developer that really makes smooth tones with your HP5. In fact, the two are kind of keyed for each other, which is great. It's a lovely developer. My kit will include my Schneider Simar S 210mm f5.6 lens, my ancient Kodak Ektar 203mm f7.7, and my favorite wide angle, well, kind of wide angle, slightly wider than normal lens, my Fuji Fujinon 125mm f5.6. So let's head into downtown Milton and get shooting. If you've ever worked with a waist level finder camera, you'll notice that everything is mirrored. If you're working with a traditional SLR, everything looks correct. That's because you have the light coming through the lens, hitting a mirror and bouncing around a prism before it hits your viewfinder. You don't have any of that with a large format camera. you simply have what you see is what you get. Light comes through the lens and is projected on ground glass, and that's how you both compose and focus your image. So you will need some sort of lens cloth. In my case, I simply use a bath towel. And from there, you simply have to think a little bit differently when composing your image, because not only are you working with this mirrored backwards upside down image, you're also working with a larger negative. So all of a sudden, what was a rather long focal length on your 35mm, a 210mm lens like the one I'm using here, becomes relatively a short telephoto. And in the same way, what is traditionally a very stopped down aperture, in the case of this image I'm shooting at f16, actually produces a much narrower depth of field. And as soon as you realize that, you can actually start using those same principles of composition and subject isolation. You just have to make it bigger, in which case f16 becomes fairly narrow, 210 becomes fairly short, and you can make better images that way. One of the most unique parts of large format photography is camera movements. Now, not all cameras are created equal in this case. The most amount of movements is with monorail cameras, and that allows you movements in both your front standard, where your lens is mounted, and the rear standard, where your ground glass is. The next one is field cameras, and that mainly focuses its movements around the front standard, where the lens is mounted. Now, I have a press camera. I do have some movements in the front standards, but not as much as the field. And you'll actually notice in this image, I'm actually going to be shifting that front standard up. And the reason is that I can eliminate sections of the image that I don't want in my composition, in this case the Milton Town Bell, and I can use that to create better images. And it also helps with focus, which is all done again through that ground glass. So the idea of the dance comes from the fact that there are several steps that you need to do to create a large format image. So here's my dance. I'll compose the image first, which I've been talking about over the past two images. Next, I will then take a meter reading and set the exposure onto the actual camera shutter, which is part of the lens itself, which is great. Next, I will then make sure to close that shutter so that I don't accidentally overexpose or pre-expose my film before I'm ready to take the shot. Once that's done, I will then load the film, double check, make sure that the exposure is correct and the shutter is closed before pulling that dark slide, and then waiting for the perfect moment to do that. Now, I've cut out a bunch of this, but when I was taking this, several cars were going past me, and I really didn't want them blocking my shot. And then once that's done, I'll put that dark slide back in and move on to the next one. When it comes to metering, I prefer to use spot metering. In my case, a Pentax Spot Meter 5. And there are two techniques that I employ for all my shooting, mostly with black and white, but I do a bit of color work also. And the first technique, which I'm going to demonstrate first, is actually I take an average between the highlights and the shadows, and then pick that middle point and set my exposure from there. And that is kind of what you want to do with all your images, but you really want that 5 stop between your shadows and your highlights. That is difficult to do in several cases, and you can adjust in development, but I personally don't do that. The second method is what I use most of the time, and that's where I take a single reading at the darkest shadow I want my most detail in, and then I simply underexpose by a stop, and that helps maintain both my shadow details and my highlight details, and is also helped by using a compensating developer like PyroCAD HD or FA1027, or even Tmax and DDX can achieve the same compensation. One of the best ways to get consistent, repeatable results is to actually take notes after shooting a frame. I normally will cover what lens, the subject matter, any movements, also the exposure, that is the film speed, the aperture, and the shutter speed. The idea is that if something does go wrong, I can look back and go, aha, that's the point. And it also helps learn and perfect your technique. So just make sure, especially when you're getting started, carry around a notebook and a pen and record what you feel makes sense. Well, I don't know about you, but that was a really cold experience and all my gear started to suffer. I don't normally shoot my large format camera in such cold temperatures. The lenses just start to seize up, and that's even after getting all of them serviced last year. You know what? If you found it an informative experience, then it was totally worth it on my part. Now, if you want to know more about large format and really dig into some of the more technical elements of it, I'm going to recommend checking out my good friend Matt Marash's channel. Every Friday, he comes out with an episode of Large Format Fridays where he talks about some element of large format photography, and you'll find a link to his channel down in the description below. If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button and ring that bell notification, and be sure to leave a like, and in the comment below, let me know what your experience with large format is. What are you looking forward to if you are going to be getting into large format? What are you hoping to get out of the practice? Or just leave a question or any sort of comment about what you've seen today. And as always, get out there, stay safe, shoot some cool film.